Ding. Hello everybody, it's Roddy here with Matthew at the Good Spirits Company again. And this week we're talking about a wee distillery on the Isle of Skye. Matthew, I hear that you've just recently been to Torabhaig.
Yeah, what gave you that idea?
No idea at all.
Yeah, I'm just back from Torabhaig. I was very well looked after by the guys up there, and just had a fantastic time. I've been a fan of Torabhaig since they came on the scene. I've just really loved their whiskies. And I think what they're trying to do up there on Skye is just fascinating. You know, as a distillery, very small, it's a beautiful place to visit. I was lucky enough to be up when the weather was good, and which is a rarity, obviously, up on the west coast.
Skye, yes.
But it's beautiful. And the distillery itself is in this listed steading, farm steading that was renovated and done up. They spent 4 years putting it back into a good enough nick to actually use. And they've crammed loads into it. So they've got 8 washbacks, a couple of wee stills. They operate they work, kind of 2 shifts a day sort of thing. So they are pretty busy, and occasionally work 3 shifts because they are producing a decent amount of liquid for a tiny distillery. But they're making just a lovely spirit. So the kind of brains behind the operation, Neil, who's kind of in charge of the bigger picture of the distillery, he loves peated spirit, but he doesn't want a peated spirit that's got a medicinal character. He wants a peated spirit that's kind of fruitier, brighter, has a smokiness, but doesn't drop down to those kind of heavy medicinal notes. Mm-hmm. And that's really what they're looking for here. So what they've done at the distillery is run a fairly short kind of head run, not to get too geeky, about 15 minutes.
No, as geeky as you like.
And then they cut in to spirit around, maybe about 75% alcohol, and then they run it down to about 64%. Okay, so they don't go deep down like Lagavulin goes down to about 58, 59%. Mm-hmm. And that's getting into the kind of the deep, heavy, kind of creosote, kind of heavy elements of peat. By cutting at 64, they just have the kind of lighter, brighter smokiness coming through, peaty notes coming through. Mm-hmm. And that really shines in the spirit because the malt they use is quite heavily peated, so it's peated to about 80 ppms, which is higher than most distilleries. Which would be
typically 50 for an Islay malt too, like Kalila or Lagavulin.
Well, Lagavulin and Kalila, they're 35. Kilhoman's 50. Ardbegg's 55. But obviously that's big numbers. It's what's in the bottle or what's in the glass that really matters. So they've got this kind of smokiness that's just beautifully in harmony with the rest of the spirit, and I love the kind of energy of the drink.
The energy.
Well, there's a brightness. There's like on the palate. It just feels alive. You know, mm-hmm. I don't know how else to describe it.
So Torabhaig, they've been on the scene for a few years now, but they've never yet done a tasting for us because they've always focused on just having a very small number of core expressions, but I understand that there's quite a lot of experimental stuff going on there. The Journeyman.
Oh yeah. So the distillery, what's fascinating about how they set it up, this is one thing I think is wonderful about what they've done. They realised when they started the distillery that they really wanted to be in the heart of the community, so they needed to keep everyone on side. And obviously Skye being on quite a popular tourist destination, accommodation is very, very hard to come by. So they knew that if they were employing people from the mainland and having to find accommodation, they'd be stuck because there isn't anything really. Very, very hard, and they didn't want to put more pressure on the housing stock on the island. So they deliberately recruited people from the island themselves, mm-hmm. and they actually asked for people with no experience of distilling. Which sounds like bonkers, really. But what they wanted to do was really take these people on a journey, recruit these people, and get them to learn about the distillery as it was getting going. So they spent about a year just developing the spirit, working out what worked, what didn't work, finding out what was the sweet spot that got them the right flavour profile. So they all learned together. They made mistakes. They learned from them. Like they supported each other through this journey. But they started off with their own skills. So we were there. We met a distiller called Doc, who's a musician. He plays the fiddle. And he was playing, we wandered in, he thought he was on his own, but he was playing the fiddle as he was waiting for the spirit run to finish. It was just such a lovely experience, and there's another distiller's a gardener by trade. So they employ 9 distillers, and they all work, normally they have a morning shift, an early shift, 2 people on, and a late shift, 2 people on, and then during the day they have 2 other distillers on. And the day shift aren't there to distill, they're there to do the maintenance. So that could be cutting the grass, looking after the flower beds, doing a bit of painting, fixing things, just doing those things. So yes, they've got 9 distillers, but they do everything. So that doesn't mean they've got mashman or maltsters or whatever. They're just, everyone does absolutely everything.
A team of 9 distillers who actually do all of the jobs.
Yeah, and it means everyone's got each other's back, which is just really nice. And
shall we?
Sorry, you talked about the journeyman thing. Sorry, let's go back.
Yes, I did.
So what they do is they ask one of the distillers to run the distillery the way they want to for 1 week a year. So for the week running up to that, they run unpeated malt just to clear through the peat that's already in the system. They then will start their projects. So we tried 3 different journeyman projects that might come out in the next 2 or 3 years.
So things that might be future products.
Yeah.
Right.
So typically, obviously they're using standard distiller's malt with peated to about 80 ppms, but the distiller could go, right, let's do completely unpeated malt, or let's use some crystal malt or pale malt or dark malt or whatever, different types of malt, different types of yeast. They're using different types of casks, so it's completely up to them. But they'll spend, because the distiller knows that this is coming up, they'll spend a year planning it and talking it through with their teammates to work out what they think would be fun, what will work, what won't work, and they'll nail it down over that period, and then it's completely up to them to do it. So it's just a fascinating, completely different experiment, and the idea currently is to, that 1 week's production, they'll bottle half of it in the first release, and then 5 years later, what's left, they'll bottle half of that again, and then 5 years later, they'll do half of that again, and then they'll be down to single casks and things. So that'll be interesting to see.
So the range is going to get bigger then in the next few.
Well, these will be, the range will get, but so obviously at the moment they've got this kind of limited range, which is their kind of core expressions, and we'll start to see these things trickling through, and they want to be like it's super geeky, it's ridiculously geeky, but it's exciting and fun, and because it's not just a one-off, it'll be something that will come back, and every year the next distiller is going to do another batch. So there's going to be 9 of these projects running, and then they're going to start again. And it's fascinating, listening to them talk, because they're so, involved with the production, and they really, and it's obviously a new project for them. They're just really, the distillers are desperate to know how people react to their whiskey. They want to know how it's going down. They're just, it's not like a big distiller that's a bit faceless, where you've just got operators who are operating. They're just working to fulfill the production demands of the high hegians, and they don't care about the liquid. These guys are intrinsically part of the fabric of it. It's just a lovely story, and a beautiful place to visit. I really recommend it.
I've never been, but I am now about to taste said liquid. So this one is the Allt Gleann,
or Gleann, or
and apologies for the pronunciation.
That's
the
okay.
Legacy series.
Yeah.
So this is kind of, as far as there can be, this is, you would call this their standard, I guess.
Yeah, this is they've got up till now they've had 2 kind of core expressions. This one, and then one with a little bit of sherry in it. They started off with this as the base, and then added a little bit of 8% sherry cask, 6% Oloroso, 2% Pedro Jimenez. just to add a bit of richness to the spirit. So this one's all ex-bourbon barrels. So I think for me this really shows the style of the spirit, because you've got that smokiness that's beautifully in keeping with the flavour profile of the spirit. It just works really well. I think it's relatively young, which comes through in this kind of energy, this brightness about it, and because of the peat, the youth is not a.
No, peated whiskies can be young. There's a lightness to it, a lightness, and the peat is a gentle sort of peat, as you say. There's none of that sort of creosote thing. Today, and I've had this before, but today I'm getting a bit of saltiness on this. But it's definitely, it's not an Isla.
No,
not an Isla peat.
Like I kind of think of a kind of floral note, like grassiness of like a bit like chamomile tea. I don't know, like that sort of kind
Not
of
something I've ever drunk.
Oh. But it's got that sort of
I can see the floral thing. I'd call that a sort of powdery floral. Like it puts me in mind of some kind of my granny's talc or something.
Yeah, I'm thinking kind of dried grass, dried flowers, that sort of direction. Yeah. But then there's like brightness, a bit of pepper, that lovely, beautiful smoke that just runs through it without smacking you around the head. Yes. It's just really nicely in keeping. Anyway, I'm just excited by them. So I like what they're doing, and they're just good folk.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll wrap up there, because that's longer than I'd planned. So that's a wee summary of how things are going at Torabhaig, as presented by Matthew, who apparently has just been there.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah, I don't know.
You can't. I don't know what gives it away.
I can't think.
All right. Till next time, folks.
Cheers. Folks.